This channel is supported by Truefire. Truefire is an online library
enough, you can get the Truefire All Access Pass for as cheap as they ever do it, the $99 thing. So just jump and do that if you're looking for the best price you can get Truefire All Access for. In amongst all the chat around the Centaur Overdrive, I actually got an email from a chap, Neal, and he kind of said cloning's, been around forever, and he was like, I think, we've got a certain view of it, and I think in the Behringer case with the Centaur, and particularly with Bill Finnegan in particular, it kind of feels like it's a little bit more cut and dry, because it's like a small guy who only was ever building clones by himself, and the industry, giants like Behringer, giants like JHS, giants like Keeley have basically kind of cashed in and said, like, we're going to build this clone of your stuff. And I think in that case, it's kind of like, right, well, David Barber kind of said it's not particularly flattering if you're taking food off their table or whatever. But I think it's also, would the Klon KTR exist if there wasn't like a cloning sort of spree? And this is one of those things that I think maybe in some cases cloning can actually show what is actually needed. And in any case, like particularly in boutique situations like with the Klon, is there something about, more people having access to what is, a special circuit? I don't know. So let's get into that a little bit in this video. And the way that I wanted to look at this one, I was just chatting to Keith from 5 Watt World a little bit, and just around some stories where like the clones can actually change things in a positive way, potentially. I thought that a good example of this was kind of what happened with Fender in the 80s and 70s. I'm reading here from fuzzface.net, and there's an article around the Fender Vintage series. Essentially, you know, there was this Dan Smith Strat and gold and walnut Strats in the early 80s, but the Strats of the 50s and 60s were essentially what people had some appetite for, apparently. Like, those were the guitars that people were passionate about. And in European markets, Tokai were getting a lot of sales, supposedly, with their superb, it says here, low-price vintage copies. Not possible to protect Fender's design from foreign competitors, Bill Schultz and Roger Balmer, head of marketing and sales, decided to produce vintage-style Fender Strats in Japan. So this happened in early 82. The Tokai stuff had been happening, and Greco and Fujigen had been happening since, I think, like in the mid-70s. Fender entered agreements to have guitars made in Japan, and at this point it scaled down production at the Fullerton plant. And so for a time, Fender guitars were made in the factories of the Japanese competitors. So kind of interesting how that has worked out. Fender were not making a 50s or a 60s reissue. They see what's happening in Japan with the clones, you know, the copies, the accurate replicas, however you want to call it, and then they start building over in Japan. And then they also decide, Dan Smith and John Page, that they would kind of design some prototypes of the 57 Strat and the 62 Strat. So these are the 82 vintage reissues that they ended up being, right? And they went through the kind of the same process that I presume the Japanese went through. Like, they went and bought a couple of vintage examples, took measurements, did all of that sort of stuff, and essentially learned to clone a guitar, which I guess the Japanese invented cloning a guitar. They had to call back in Seymour Duncan. Ibarra could reproduce the way that they were manufacturing vintage style pickups, but they didn't have sort of technical data. So they then looked at Seth Lover's files and specs from when he worked at Fender. At this stage, Fender was, you know, listening to what people wanted, and there was certain bits that were missing because they were sure that players didn't want these certain things. So like deep V-necks and dot spacing were not important to them, they thought. You know, so the accuracy of them at this point was not even considered that important by the marketing or dealers and that sort of stuff. Apparently they started with 100% Nitro paint when the first vintage models came out. Dealers complained about grain shrinkage and irregularities showing through, which is kind of funny to think about when you look back now. That's exactly what people want. We told them, well, it's lacquer like vintage, but they said, yeah, we don't want to see that. So we started doing urethane undercoats, which really annoys a lot of people, and nitro top coats. Interesting stuff. So dealers there getting in the way of us having, you know, accurate vintage reissues. And to the point this cloning was so important in changing the fate of Fender that basically in the 82 catalogue there is a Tokai machine head which is visible in the catalogue apparently. I can't find this, but that's because basically Dan Smith and folks at Fender had all of these vintage Japanese guitars, not vintage replicas, these counterfeit, essentially these clones of the American guitars. They were using them to sort of work off as well. So it's kind of interesting. Now, in the pedal world, obviously we're very used to this idea. In the video here, I got this out for the first time. So this is a Chinese company, NUX, right? And I guess you could tell from the look of it that it's basically a clone of a clone. So the Vemuram Jan Ray was essentially a clone of a Timmy with a couple of minor adjustments, but that's basically the topology of it. And the thing that flips the Vemuram Timmy thing on its head is that the Vemuram is actually quite a lot more expensive. So it's like a premium clone, if you like, you know, sticking it in a brass enclosure and all that sort of stuff, and charging maybe 3 times the price that you would charge for a Paul Cochrane Timmy. So that's kind of interesting in its own right as well. And then the NUX, this is probably like a 30-40 quid pedal, basically takes that circuit and kind of re-clones it as a slightly cheaper model. So it's kind of just I don't know, once you get away from the thinking of like, is this wrong, is this right, it's kind of just, I guess, one of these things that happens. And in some regards, I think for the player, the cloning thing is probably a good thing, right? So if there are great circuits that are worthy of cloning, then what it does mean, like Dan Electro, I think, are the first people that did this really. They basically brought out a cheaper version of a few boutique pedals, one of which was the Timmy with the Dan Electro OD1, I think it was called, or something like that. And yeah, again, it's one of those things that you've got to imagine that if you're getting your stuff cloned, it's going to be super annoying and probably taking money out of your pocket in many ways. And I imagine there should be, like, you know, you think about it, there should be a fair way to do this, in that, you know, if it is an original design that you're copying, that maybe they could get some royalty for that. But, you know, oftentimes these things are just happening without any permission, so I think the horse has left the stable on that one, right? But as a player as well, you know, certainly growing up, I definitely made use of like the cloning stuff. So like the Joyo Deluxe, I had one of those. That one was a clone of a Tech 21, right? I think that's right. And what else was there? You know, I would use NuX pedals. I had some Joyo pedals. And I guess the difficult and ironic thing about some of this is that some of this stuff is good enough that you could literally just paint, you know, a Joyo overdrive, give it a different enclosure, and to some extent that fooled quite a lot of people for quite a while, the Freakish Blues Alpha Drive. So I think there's a lot to think about in terms of clones, but more than anything, I think it's important to remember that these things have happened, and that in some cases there are positive effects that can happen from them. It's hard to see what the Behringer Centaur thing is actually going to do that's of a benefit to much of the guitar community. And likewise, you know, someone else bringing out yet another clone feels like a little bit redundant at this point. But, you know, I've not seen too many Jan Ray clones around, so I think in some cases cloning clones and making these things more available for, you know, players that maybe can't afford the super expensive stuff, I think it's an interesting idea still. And again, like we've said with the Tokai stuff and Greco, those really did change the fate of Fender. So basically that's what we've got to thank for Fender now actually still making guitars that resonate with people like us. You know, I definitely, of all of the Fender guitars that they make, am more interested in the American vintage stuff than any of the other stuff. So that's all about cloning, really. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. Any clone pedals that you've had that you dig? Yeah, this one sounded alright, I thought.